I'm going to give you a tour of the After Effects workspace, also known as the user interface. To follow along, go to the Working Files folder, open it up, open up the After Effects Projects folder, and then double-click on 0203 Workspace. This project has a number of comps in it. I wanted to populate it with assets and comps just to give you kind of a realistic feel as we tour this workspace. The first thing I want you to do is to make sure we're on the same page, and to do that I want you to go to the Workspace drop-down list here at the top. Click on the drop-down list and either click on Standard, or if it's already selected like this, click on Reset Standard. Then click OK. That way we're working with the same workspace. Now, if you've worked with other Adobe video or audio applications, this workspace is going to look awfully darn familiar. That's because Adobe has made workspaces in its video and audio products such as Premiere Pro, Encore, Audition, and After Effects. It's made those workspaces consistent and customizable. That means when you go from one of those audio or video applications to another, it's going to look familiar. It's going to look comfortable. You're going to be able to make the change without too much trouble. There'll be differences, of course, but in general, the way the workspace works will be the same. Now, the workspace is organized into panels, panel groups, and frames. So each of these little guys here is considered a panel all the way around the workspace here. These are all panels. You can see their panels by these little tabs here, and when you click on one, you get this little yellow or orange border around it saying that's the currently active one. Down here is the timeline panel. You click on that, you have 5 comps residing inside this timeline panel, so that makes this a panel group. Wherever you got panels or groups, then they reside inside a frame, which is not really identified. You don't see a border around it, but this is considered a frame. Frame is a term that isn't used all that often inside Adobe anymore, but basically this little area in which a panel resides is considered a frame. There are 2 types of panels. I'll show you that by going to the Window menu and clicking on that. These are the panels. There are standard panels here from A to W. And then there are viewers. These are the 5 viewers: the composition panel, effect controls, flowchart, footage, and layer. Then there are a couple of other standard panels down here, which are not in this alphabetical listing, which can get a little confusing. There's the project panel and the render queue, and then all these comps, which have the word timeline in front of them. So it can be a little bit confusing. There isn't a timeline panel here by itself. There's always timeline with this colon next to the comp name there, and there are 5 comps that are currently inside the timeline. Now, the check marks mean that this panel is forward. That means it's the currently visible panel. If there is no check mark, it doesn't mean the panel is not present in the interface. It just means that it's not forward. So, for example, I'll close this menu up for a moment, and I'll change this from the 3D camera tracking comp to the masks comp. Go back to the window menu, and you'll see now that the check mark is next to the masks comp. Now, I want to show you some of these viewers. And the one that is most important to me is the Effect Controls panel. And here inside the standard workspace, the Effect Controls panel is not present. And I think it should be. So one of the things about After Effects is that you can customize the workspace. And I'm going to explain how you customize the workspace in the next lesson. But I'm going to add the Effect Controls panel now by just going back to the window menu, going down to Effect Controls and clicking on that. Not only will that add that to this panel group here, it puts it front and center. And if I want to see an effect inside the Effect Controls panel, I need to highlight a layer that has an effect in it. So I'm going to go to the 3D camera tracking thing here and click on Buildings, and that has an effect in it. There you see the effect inside the Effect Controls panel. Now that I've added the Effect Controls panel, though, when I close this down and reopen it, it will be here whether I save this as a customized workspace or not. After Effects remembers whatever your last layout was, and so when you come back here, this Effect Controls panel will be available rather than when you open up the standard workspace and it goes away. I also want to take a look at some of the other viewers, the footage and the layer viewers. To see the footage viewer, I could go back to Window and click on this and click on Footage, but there's nothing in the footage viewer. It would just be blank. So I'd rather open it another way. I'm going to go down here and look at a clip here, let's say the Vineyard clip. I'm going to double click on that here inside the project panel. When I do that, it opens up the footage viewer. It lets me see assets that are inside the project panel. I can open them up here. I can scroll through them or scrub through them like that. And this is a way to preview things. You notice there's a little window up here. It looks like you can play it here, but this shows you a thumbnail. It doesn't show you the actual video. Over here, you can see the video inside the footage panel. And sometimes it's confusing when you go from the footage panel to the composition panel. You're not really sure. Am I in the footage panel or am I in the composition panel? But the footage panel has this little timeline down here. So that's kind of your clue that you're not in the composition panel now. You're looking at the footage panel instead. The other viewer that's used pretty often is the layer viewer, and you access that from a layer. So I'm going to go back over here to the masks. I want to open up the tennis background clip. Now, if I opened it up over here inside the project panel, it would open up inside the footage viewer or the footage panel. But I want to view it here inside the layer panel. So I double click on it, and now it opens up inside the layer panel. This is even more confusing, I think. Here you got layer looking exactly like composition, right? So how do you know, again, which is different? Well, the composition never has a timeline on the bottom of it. The layer panel does. And you use the layer panel only under a few instances. The most common use is when you use the paint tool. So let's say you have a paint tool over here, and you can paint on the layer panel. You cannot paint on the composition panel. If I click here, I'm going to get a little message saying you can't paint on it, folks. You got to paint only on the layer panel. Just so you know, that's one reason why you use the layer panel. And there are a few other reasons as well. So those are the viewers. Now, you don't have to have all these guys open. I'm going to close them by clicking on this one here and clicking on this little X. And that closes that comp. If I want to reopen that comp, I can go back to it over here, the 3D camera text layer, and double click on it, and it opens it back up. If I click it again, I'm going to open up the window menu, and you'll see that fifth one, that one we just closed, is not available. The one that says text in it, it's no longer available here. These guys have to be inside the timeline panel to show up here inside the window menu. So the way you open up a comp again is by double clicking it over here. And get rid of another one by clicking on it, like that. I want to simplify things here. Another way to access these various comps is by going up to the composition drop-down list. Right now there's only one there because I closed so many. If I go back and reopen these guys, I can switch from one comp to another up here in this little drop-down list for the composition menu, just by clicking on it like so. There you go. Now that we've made all these changes to the workspace, I'm going to close this project and reopen it. Now, we did make some changes to a couple of the layers here just inadvertently as we went along. So it's going to ask me if I want to save it. I'm going to say no. And let's see what happens when we reopen it. So I'm going to close it now. It says you want to save it. I'm going to say don't save it. I'm going to go back and reopen it and see what happens. And it comes back and now has those panels up here, but nothing's inside them. It doesn't remember what was inside them, but it does remember that you did have these panels open. Also, the Effect Controls panel is now open here as well, despite the fact that there's currently nothing inside there. So if I now go back to the standard workspace, if I go here, standard, reset standard, it's going to get rid of these two and get rid of the Effect Controls panel and go back to the standard workspace, like so. We say yes, and now we're back. And the Effect Controls panel and the two other viewers here are no longer inside the workspace. So that is how you can work with panels inside this workspace. I'm going to explain how you customize the workspace in the next lesson.